It's an attack that killed at least 70 people, most of them women and children. Pakistan says it's launching a paramilitary crackdown in Punjab to stop armed groups, while its capital, Islamabad, is at a standstill because of protests. So where does Pakistan go from here? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Dareen Abughaida. It was planned to cause maximum loss of life. Christian families were celebrating Easter in a popular park in Lahore when a suicide bomber blew himself up. Many Pakistanis have unfortunately grown used to these kinds of attacks, particularly in the northwest. That's where the military has been fighting armed groups for years. But Sunday's attack is different. The armed group that's responsible, Jamaat al-Ahrar, says Pakistan's Christian minority was the intended target. It's part of a number of recent sectarian attacks that are becoming more common in Pakistan. Much of the violence is being directed either at Christians or other minority sects within Islam. Let's bring in our guests for the show. In Islamabad, we're joined by Tom Hussain. He's a Pakistani security specialist and Asia-Pacific editor of The World Weekly. In Karachi, Bina, Shah, a writer and author of the book A Season for Martyrs. And in London, Omar Waraich, a journalist who has covered Pakistani politics and blasphemy laws. Welcome to all of you to Inside Story. Bina, so as we're saying, a splinter faction of the Pakistani Taliban claiming responsibility for that blast in Lahore, saying Christians were the intended target. Why are Christians being targeted?
It's very hard to say, but this isn't the first time that this particular group has attacked Christians. Last year, in fact, in March of 2015, they attacked two churches in Lahore and killed about 15 people, injured many others. So Christians as a minority, as non-Muslims, are the target of their particular venom.
Tom, according to military sources speaking to Pakistani media, what they are saying is that the army is going to conduct a full-blown operation across Punjab to target these militants. What do you know about this operation that's been announced, and how possible is military action in Punjab?
I think you'll have intelligence-led operations similar to those undergoing in Karachi. They have a fair idea, the authorities, of where these group sympathizers are located. And indeed, we've seen raids overnight across the Punjab in major cities. So they do have a fair idea where these sympathizers are. It really has been a question of taking the political decision to go after them, then looking to the timing of the operation, see whether that's expedient with the rest of the counter-offensive which is ongoing. So I think you'll find that it'll be largely intelligence-led operations using more often than not paramilitary troops and sometimes special forces.
Here's the thing. Let me just stick with you for a moment, Tom, excuse me. In 2015, the government in Pakistan said the number of organizations that are actively engaged in what they're saying terrorism and extremism in Punjab province alone was 95. And that, in fact, was an increase on the number before. So has the government been in denial about Punjab's militancy problem up until this point?
I don't think it's a denial as much as it is them wanting to time it in a way that they have the assets in place to carry it out. There was resistance to the idea of military intervention from the provincial government, and that's for political reasons. But it's not that they didn't know or they didn't want to do it, it's about the timing of the operation because they're so heavily engaged in the tribal areas in Karachi and elsewhere.
Omar, what do you make of that? Is it all about the timing, and is a military operation the answer up until this point? And also, Omar, why wasn't there protection that was given to these Christian families that have been targeted in the past?
Well, I have to disagree with Tom there slightly, because if it was about timing, then they've been waiting a very long time. There have been attacks on Christians across Punjab. I mean, going back several years. I remember covering Gujra, where an entire colony of Christians was attacked. I covered one subsequently in 2013 in Lahore. They've been terrorist attacks, as Bina mentioned, on Christians in Lahore. So we've known for a very long time that southern Punjab is filled with many militant elements scattered in different places. The reluctance, as Tom mentioned, has been from the civilian government, who, because it's their political base, haven't been wanting to expend political capital on taking them on there. Of course, this will have to be ultimately led by intelligence and by civilian law enforcement authorities. There are very real limits on what the military can do, because military operations are a sledgehammer.
So what is it that the civilian-led government can do, Omar?
Well, I mean simple things like identifying who these groups are, identifying where the funding is, identifying where they get their arms and munitions.
Is there enough determination right now, though? Right, but is there enough determination right now for the government to want to do this?
Well, there hasn't been for a long time, but I think an attack like today, which has earned global attention and actually raised questions about the government's resolve to protect religious minorities, may force them to. I mean, they may have looked away for a very long time, but it makes it increasingly difficult for them to continue with that policy.
Bina, do they have the resolve to protect these minorities? A lot of people asking why the Christians were not given enough protection before this horrific attack that took place in Lahore.
Unfortunately, it's been a hallmark of this government and previous governments to remain very apathetic to the security situation of non-Muslims, of non-Sunni Muslims. Christians aren't the only minority groups that are being attacked. It's been Hazara Shias in the past. It's been Hindus in the past. And I would say, going back to your earlier question to both Tom and Omar about the government, the political government's role in this, their job is to build consensus in the parliament, in the Senate, as happened after the APS attacks on the Army Public School in Peshawar in December 2014. There were unanimous resolutions in the Senate and in the national and provincial assemblies to approve of a decisive military action. The same political will has to be put forth in the parliament with the support of Pakistan's population, which it has at the moment, if it would just take the lead and go for it.
Well, some say that Jamaat al-Ahrar is capitalizing on the growing disillusionment with the Pakistani government. The armed group's attack in Lahore on Sunday coincided with protests in Islamabad. Thousands of Pakistanis gathered to support stricter enforcement of the country's blasphemy laws. Al Jazeera's Imran Khan has more from Islamabad.
This defiant protest seemingly came out of nowhere. On Sunday, thousands came to Islamabad to celebrate the life of Mumtaz Qadri. He was a police officer who killed a man he was sent to protect, the outspoken politician Salman Taseer. Taseer had taken up the cause of a Christian woman who was accused and then acquitted of blasphemy. His support of her case angered some in Pakistan, and Qadri shot Taseer 5 years ago. Qadri was executed for that crime on February 29th of this year. Since then, Pakistan's hardline religious parties have rallied in his support, and they've spoken out against the government and those they say they're against Islam.
People from within your ranks will kill you. Your bodyguards will kill you. Your servants will kill you. Mumtaz Qadri is in the people's hearts and minds. The people will rise up. No one is safe. The people will not spare even the Prime Minister. God has put hope in their hearts.
The protesters have brought the centre of Islamabad to a standstill. The army is now out on the streets and trying to contain the crowds. Some of the protesters include groups who have shown open sympathy to the Pakistani Taliban. The mobs attacked anything that they saw as being a symbol of the government. What you can see behind me are containers. They were put there by the government to try and stop people from coming in. And it just goes to show you how angry that they were. Take a look at the damage around you. The demands of the protesters are clear. They want Mumtaz Qadri to be declared a national hero and for the Christian woman to be rearrested and executed. They also want all those in jail on blasphemy charges to face the same fate. It's unlikely the government will accept their demand, but their voices are being heard across the nation nonetheless. Imran Khan, Al Jazeera, Islamabad.
Tom, so where you talk to us from, Islamabad, that is exactly the scene of those protests. And when you see these people coming out in their thousands supporting Qadri, what does that tell you?
Well, it tells me that a particular sect with a political agenda is trying to exploit this situation. But I can say with great surety that there are a small number of people, and in fact many of the protesters that you're seeing there who've caused the trouble are troublemakers who are hired on a daily wage basis. I've been into that areas of Rawalpindi where they've been hired from, Pirbadai, Chorchog, Allahabad, and it's a bit of a routine in Islamabad that when anyone wants to cause trouble in the capital, they hire troublemakers, thugs, whatever you would call them, to join their ranks. It might seem like the government is being overwhelmed, but the government is caught in a bit of a spot here, because if they go with a full-out riot control act, it builds sympathy for these people among the general public. So they're playing the waiting game as they have in the past.
Omar, do you agree? Are they simply hired troublemakers, or does this really point to that there could be sympathy amongst some in Pakistan towards extremist groups?
Well, we've got some history in this case. The first was after Salman Taseer was assassinated. Qadri was hailed as a hero. He was hailed as a hero by broad sections of Pakistanis. There were a number of large demonstrations that had tens of thousands of people. More recently, there was Qadri's funeral, which took place in Rawalpindi, and that brought out, by conservative estimates, 100,000 people. That's a lot of money to be paying if you're going to be hiring them. So I don't think they're all for hire. The ones who stay overnight maybe to augment these ranks, but there is a serious problem where you do have a large enough section, it's still very much a minority, I have no doubts about that, but a large enough section of society who consider Mumtaz Qadri to be a hero and hold and share the extremist views that are on display right now in the capital in Islamabad.
But Bina, does this have the potential to snowball into something bigger?
It all depends on what action the government takes at this point. I mean, the time is ripe for the government to put its foot down. There are people saying that the protesters should not have been allowed into Islamabad in the first place, let alone to march on the area known as the Red Zone, which is where a lot of the embassies and diplomatic missions and the Pakistani parliament, the high security installations are. So the government really needs to show a bit of strength. It doesn't necessarily need to threaten the protesters with inordinate force, but it does need to say that we are not going to stand for this. This is a show, and you don't have power on your side. We do. People in Pakistan are actually waiting for the government to make that move and to come out with that very strong message.
But how confident
So
are you
far,
that the
it
government
isn't.
will actually make that move?
I think the government tends to make the move only when it's very much pushed in the corner to do so. And it can be a case of a little too late, but I don't see this situation as going to spiral out of control. I see it more as bubbling up, being pushed back down, bubbling up again, pushing back down. And this kind of cycle can go on infinitely in Pakistan, as we well know.
Tom, you're shaking your head there?
Oh yeah, I'm agreeing with what she says. It's very characteristic of the way politics is done over here. But I would like to point out that the people who are actually conducting this particular protest, they belong to the Barelvi sect, which is a Sufistic sect of Sunni Islam. They are just one group. They have not been joined by other traits of like the Deobandi school. Yes, people may generally...
group.
Omar, go ahead.
It is the
Omar.
majority. Yes, it's the majority group.
The Barelvis are overwhelmingly the majority. The Deobandis only make up about 20%.
They've never won any seats in, 40 years in the National Assembly?
Oh, they don't do politics, but I mean, if you were to go and think about Barelvis, there is at least, I mean, it's the largest sect of Islam within Pakistan. That's just the fact.
Yeah, sure, I grew up in a Barelvi household myself. But I think the point here is, I'd go with what Bina is saying, that people will follow what direction the government gives them.
Is that
right
the case,
now
though,
we
in
have a
Pakistan, or does it seem like these groups are the ones that are actually forcing the agenda?
But they are forcing the agenda and waiting for the government to do something which would raise their profile. If they went in hard, it would raise their profile, they'd get more sympathy. So people may have latent sympathies for Qadri and the people who are protesting, but it's not like they're going to jump out in the streets and cause, all kinds of chaos, or they're not. If you're thinking about the majority of Pakistanis, you'd be expecting a lot of people on the roads if they were really behind this issue. These guys can't raise more than 25,000 people in Islamabad. I disagree with Umar's head count in Rawalpindi. It was nothing near 100,000. I happened to be there on the day. I think we in the television business know that a large crowd...
Wasn't that the largest funeral you've seen?
Sorry?
Could I step in here?
I said, isn't that the largest funeral you've seen?
Omar, I'll let Omar have his word, and then Bina, I'll cross over to you. Omar, go ahead.
Yeah.
I mean, I agree with Tom that this is not a decisive protest. They don't have the numbers to force the government out. They don't represent a majority. But they do, I will insist, represent very large numbers. And this is a very well-organized group. They can't, they may not just necessarily disappear. This is also a group that traditionally, as Tom mentioned, has stayed out of politics. They do not normally come out onto the streets. They don't fight elections. They aren't so prominently involved. What we're seeing, and we've seen this over the last couple of years, is that the civilian government in Pakistan is becoming more and more vulnerable to public protests. 2 years ago, it was political parties protesting on the streets against, what they thought were allegedly rigged elections. Now, because of those actions, these groups have suddenly become more emboldened. They feel they can confront the government directly. What they're trying to do is force the government to capitulate. So it will actually take a great deal of resolve to resist those demands and see these protests through.
Bina, you wanted to get a word in?
I did. I wanted to say that I think it's important to acknowledge that the people that are on the streets protesting at the moment are a voice. They are a voice in Pakistan. Now, we can argue about how big that voice is, how small that voice is. The point is, it is not being seen as a legitimate voice because they are not using legitimate means to get their message across. They're using terrorism, intimidation, and violence. They have never been part of the political process. Anytime the religious parties have contested elections, they've been roundly defeated, which shows you that the Pakistani population doesn't actually want to give them political power. They are useful as a rhetorical device that can be used either by the government or by other people that are in favor of their ascension. Whether or not these things are actually going to take place as they are imagining or hoping to do so is very unlikely. But they retain their power to be an irritant, and they retain their power to go around in different parts of Pakistan and destabilize and spread terror and insecurity. And that is a lot more difficult to counter than if they were actually using legitimate means by which to voice their demands.
Tom, you've written that a nation can only move forward with common purpose when it's reconciled with its past and has forged a shared identity. What exactly do you mean by this, and how does Pakistan do this?
I couldn't say how they would do it, but what I mean by it is that this country is very young, and because we've had dictatorships, the odd democracy, then dictatorship, there is still not that clear a sense of a national identity, what it means to be a Pakistani. I think until the government looks back and itself highlights where they went wrong, and by the government I mean all pillars of the state, whether it's the civilian government or the military or whosoever, and coming to terms with that truth and learning from those mistakes, giving the people here in Pakistan the clarity so they don't get drawn by these extremist groups or express very fire shoot from the hip kind of opinions. That is the one thing which Pakistan has been lacking for a long time and still lacks to this day.
You know, we speak of extremist groups. Omar, I'll come over to you now. And this group that conducted that blast in Lahore, it's called Jamaat al-Ahrar, as we're saying. And what we understand is that they broke away from the Pakistani Taliban last year. They then declared allegiance to ISIL and then announced that it was rejoining the Taliban insurgency. Do you know what that move was actually prompted by?
I don't know the specifics, but what we do know is that this is an offshoot, there's a very vicious offshoot, that is also entirely opportunistic. What they seek to do is create maximum casualties for maximum publicity. That's their only agenda. I don't think they've got a coherent political agenda.
So what I'm trying to understand is how the Pakistani government can tackle all these various splinter groups that are now in Pakistan.
Well, it will have to tackle them the way it tackles, you know, the main groups, which is to strike at their leaderships, to strike at their infrastructure, to strike at their bases, to deal with the facilitators who allow them to have access to cities like Lahore, to reinforce a narrative. I completely agree with what Tom said earlier. One of the great big problems is that there hasn't been a coherent narrative of Pakistani nationalism and citizenship. What these groups are trying to do, the problem was that there was only a sort of a nominal sense of what religion meant or what Islam meant or what identity of people as Pakistanis or as Muslims or as non-Muslims within Pakistan meant. What these groups are trying to do is seize on these labels and say, no, their brand of Islam is what Pakistan was supposed to represent, or their attitude towards non-Muslims is what Pakistan is supposed to represent. They're trying to add their own content to what has been a historically weak and superficial sense of Pakistani nationalism. And that needs to be countered by a robust narrative that can actually give Pakistanis answers to these questions, that can actually say, this is the form of citizenship that you have. This is your contract with the state. And according to that contract, religious minorities, be they within Islam, or be they Christians, or be they Hindus, or be they Sikhs, or dare I say, be they people who actually don't subscribe to a mainstream religion, have an equal say and have equal status as citizens.
Is this something that you think you will see, Omar, from the current Pakistani government?
Well, one has to be optimistic. That's actually kind of what drives Pakistan, is there is a resilience and there is a great optimism. I mean, I was very moved by scenes I saw just after the attack, where people are rushing to the hospital to donate blood, where people are trying to help the victims, with rescue efforts, or whether it's in terms of sending food to Christian communities in Lahore. So I think from the majority, there certainly is a will. And while we do have this problem, while there is a problem in Pakistan, of this very vocal and I would say numerically strong a strain of extremism, there is a challenge from within civil society, from different strands of Pakistani citizens who are willing to have this fight and stand up to their narrative. And I think in the end, that will be a very long, very difficult process that will have gains, that will have setbacks, but I think it's ultimately one that the people of Pakistan will win.
Well, Bina, you've written that religious extremists will never succeed in taking over Pakistan. But what makes you so sure?
Well, I'm also displaying some of that optimism that Omar spoke about, and quoting the Oscar winner Sharmeen Obaid-Chinoy, when you live in Pakistan, you have to have hope. But I would like to say one thing about the position of Pakistan's minorities, and that is that there is a problem with how they are seen and how they are placed in society. Pakistanis pride themselves on being very tolerant of their minorities and of living in a situation of coexistence with them. But what we do see is that Pakistan's minorities have no share in the power system of the country. In fact, they have been increasingly disempowered. They've been removed from posts of power in the government, in the bureaucracy, in the armed forces, so on and so forth. And when you have this kind of process going on of disempowerment and gradual making their space to exist smaller and smaller and smaller,
Right.
then this is a more bothersome trend that is going to be really hard to reverse, but we have to reverse it in order to make things better
We'll
for all
have
of
to
them.
leave it on that note. Thank you very much for joining us, Bina, Shah, Omar, Waraich, and Tom Hussain. And thank you for watching. You can see this program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, you can go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter, our handle @AJ Inside Story. For myself and the whole team here in Doha, goodbye for now.